All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to have a frequent contributor to us, and he wears many hats. He's a former mayor at a show here on WLAE, and he's worked with nonprofit organizations on a lot of coastal issues, and one of those issues is the dead zone, also red tides, algae blooms, and of course with the opening of the Bonnet Carré spillway and the enormous amount of water coming across the Mississippi River, there's a lot to talk to this gentleman about. And let's welcome Charles Marsala. And Charles, how you doing?
Great, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
So you're executive producer of AWE.News. Tell us about AWE.News.
Well, you know, when I was on WLAE, we were focused on people doing a great job to save endangered species. And as we were doing this, there was a big red tide in December off the coast of Biloxi, and it killed thousands of fish. We went down there to look at that, and I realized that we need to start focusing not only on endangered species, but on coastal issues. Restoration being one, but also the dead zone in the Gulf. It was unbelievable how big it is. It needs to be addressed.
And we've got some images to show folks about the dead zone that you provided, Charles. Could that be one of the reasons why we're having all these dolphins show up today?
Absolutely. What I don't think people understand is that we now grow much more corn than we ever did, mainly for ethanol, but also for food. We're using a lot more fertilizer to do that, even weed killers. We've heard about Roundup recently in the news. So that nitrogen and phosphorus goes into the Mississippi River, and it comes down, and when they opened the Bonnet Carré spillway, that was the dolphin kill that you're talking about. And as we've seen in the last few days, where we're seeing the beaches being closed in Mandeville and the fishing being restricted in Mandeville, so that the Bonnet Carré was full of all these nutrients, they call them, but they're really fertilizer. It wasn't used. So when the rains hit up north, they washed all that down into the river, and it comes down to us. Normally it goes all the way to Grand Isle, it comes out of the Mississippi, and then goes along the coast of Louisiana. It's 8,000 square miles, Jeff, down there.
Okay, so let's start talking about Mandeville. And are the beaches there being closed and all the problems we're having on the North Shore, Slidell, and other areas, is that due to the Bonnet Carré spillway?
Yes. And again with that is, when the opening of the Bonnet Carré is the first time New Orleans is really seeing what the river water really contains. Because normally those nutrients go all the way to Grand Isle. We don't really pay attention to it because it's about 20 miles off the coast. But it does impact the cost of shrimp. If you're a shrimper, you got to go to the other side of the dead zone to get your shrimp. Here, now that we're seeing it for the first time in the lake, we now realize how bad it is.
So should people not swim in the lake, not fish in the lake, no seafood from Lake Pontchartrain?
You can get diarrhea. There's a lot of symptoms you can catch from doing that. Even like if you fell and you take in the water, but if you skin yourself, a cut could take in some of that bacteria.
So, talked about the Gulf. I mean, so since this first was observed back in the 50s to today, we're talking about a much bigger area, right?
It's triple what they started.
Wow.
And oddly enough, the goal right now is only 25% what it is. So they've been monitoring it. They set up a fabulous facility in Cocotree under Dave Treen in 1985. And yet all they've been able to do is watch it grow. There's been no legislation. And the thing I talk about, when we talk about going to Iowa, the presidential debates, imagine if those guys went to Iowa and said, we're going to restrict the way you farm to save New Orleans. And that would be a really big environmental thing for the primary people to do.
Now, as far as these dead zones, I mean, in the dead zones, there's, there are fish in there, right?
No, I'm a scuba diver, and a dead zone would be like scuba diving in your swimming pool. That's what you see.
Okay, so there's nothing living. The dead zone is truly dead.
It's dead. There's not enough oxygen in it for fish to live. There's not enough oxygen in it for shrimp, for crab. I mean, it just completely is dead.
And as we're looking at there, I mean, that's a massive area.
It is unbelievable how big it is. And there's 500 of them in the world. Gulf of Mexico is number 2. And to put this in perspective, which add a little bit of humor to this, if we can, Alfred Hitchcock movie The Birds took place in 1962. In 1961, he was eating in Monterey. Birds were flying into the windows of the restaurants. Okay, they had lost their short-term memory. These dead zones, when a bird eats that type of algae, it causes short-term memory loss. So the birds was inspired by that event.
Wow, that is very interesting. Now, to deal with this, we need to do something about all this ethanol?
Well, but it's either need retention ponds, but with the floods we had this year, if you were 3 or 4 miles away from a river, those farms flooded. And all that fertilizer gets washed into the river. So typically a retention pond might work, but in the situations we're having now, it doesn't. So you've got to come up with a better way to grow the ethanol, a better way, less fertilizer has to be used, or else we're going to see this.
So we're using too much fertilizer?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And actually, I want to say Phyllis Taylor put up $1 million through Tulane to find ways to grow corn with less fertilizer.
Really? Tell us what's going on in the Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay.
Well, the thing, again, this is worldwide. Chesapeake Bay, their oysters are in short supply because they have a dead zone in the bay. In the Great Lakes, they actually had to close the water intakes for a few days. And this is when I met Governor Kasich. He was actually in New Orleans. He passed legislation and signed it to restrict what they were doing because they were putting fertilizer on ice, waiting for it to melt and realizing it was running off. So all these areas, and even now in Iowa, it's backing up because when you have it, it's typically in a place where there's not a lot of movement of the water. Florida is an example. Last year we saw large turtles, marlin, big animals start, manatees being impacted by dead zones.
So, and you talked about the presidential candidates in Iowa. I mean, they go up there to Iowa and they pander to those farmers because Iowa has such a big role in the presidential race. They're never going to do anything that's going to negatively impact Iowa.
That's what I mean. It's amazing to watch. Last night I was watching debate. They will talk about the environment, but no one's going to talk about restricting the farmers and ethanol.
And you think that that's essential?
If you look at the maps of the country, Illinois and Iowa are the biggest contributors to fertilizer use, and that's coming down to us. That and actually, when I ran a few years ago for Senate, that was one of my campaign parts: is that a senator or somebody from Louisiana needs to start informing the rest of the country that what you do impacts us.
Yeah, and I don't think that's really being done effectively.
I can't imagine a candidate up there for president saying, with the Iowa caucus being the first out the blocks to say, it'd be suicide.
Yeah, right. But I mean, it really should be done.
And it's going to have to be. And at one point, Iowa actually closed some of their beaches recently because they are having their own dead zones.
So until we do something about this, these dead zones are just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger?
They have, and it's a shame. We see every year right now, we see either the record or it's near the record. So we're now over 8,000 square miles, and there's no end in sight, really. It's sad to say we built this facility 30 years ago, and we've got no results to show for it.
Wow. Well, Charles, thank you for sounding the alarm. Thanks for informing us about it. Appreciate it. And folks, check out Charles's site and keep updated on what he does, and that's AWE.News for all the latest. Thank you,
We have a half-hour special on this if you go to our website.
Okay, very good.
Thank you, Jeff.
When we come back, some of our WGSO colleagues will be joining us. That's next, right here on Ringside.